Vietnam. Now we've got the first of our online presentations coming up. So this is Carbon Neutral by 2030, CN30, presented by Dr. Margaret Jewell, Program Manager, Environmental Sustainability, MLA. Come in, Canberra.
I'm actually in Brisbane, Dominic, but thank you for that welcome. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
And see my screen as well?
Yes, yes, we can. I think we have a video version coming on that side.
I'll let you tell me when you'd like me to kick off.
Yep. Just waiting for the English language one to come up. All right, I think we're good now. Good to go?
Okay.
Thanks, Margaret, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, and hello everyone, and thanks to my Vietnamese colleague for the previous presentation. It was so interesting to hear about activities that are happening over there. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today, but hopefully we'll continue to collaborate into the future. So I'm here to give an overview of the Australian red meat industry's Carbon Neutral by 2030 initiative, which is known as CN30. And my name's Margaret Jewell, so I work for Meat and Livestock Australia, which is the organisation that Spencer, who was speaking. So today I'll go through three parts in my talk. I'll firstly talk about what CN30 is and why we've made the investment. Then I'll talk about what the investments are that Meat and Livestock Australia, along with our partners, are pursuing in trying to achieve CN30. And then I'll finish with talking about some thoughts around coordination and collaboration between Australia and Vietnam, but also the rest of the world. So starting with CN30. CN30 is quite ambitious compared with some of the other targets that are being set around the world. It's a target for the Australian red meat industry to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And I think Spencer mentioned in Australia, Meat and Livestock Australia look after the red meat industry, and included in that are beef cattle, sheep meat and goats. So some of the other livestock species that have been mentioned earlier aren't within our remit and have got separate targets. So MLA's role in CN30, we're the service provider for the red meat industry. So we are working with partners that represent state and federal government departments, other research organisations, private enterprise and industry stakeholders in conducting research, development and adoption to develop technologies that the red meat industry can implement on farm and through other parts of the supply chain in order to try and reduce their net emissions and ultimately achieve a target where the emissions are balanced out by the equivalent amount of carbon stored in the landscape. So this is just a chart or a slide to talk about some of the similarities and differences between the industry in Australia and in other parts of the world. So firstly, the CN30 target was set in 2017, and it was off the back of our federal scientific organisation, the CSIRO, who did a study that showed that achieving a carbon neutral position for the red meat industry in Australia was achievable, but was also very, very ambitious. It's recognised, CN30 recognises that we've got a very vast area of land that we produce livestock on in Australia. So it's about 355 million hectares, about half of the landmass of Australia is used for livestock production. And that gives us a lot of area where there's opportunity to store carbon in trees and soil. But it's also important to note that in Australia, I note that in Vietnam, the cattle herd is 6 million. We've got slightly more cattle than that with 25 million head, 68 million sheep, and 4 million goats. And those numbers are a couple of years old. They're a bit bigger right now. So we do have reasonably large. Yeah, they've got a lot more livestock than we have in Australia. So relative to a lot of other big livestock producing countries, we have a very small number of head. And very importantly, we've got a very small proportion of our livestock that's being produced in intensive systems or housed or feedlot systems that enable us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from animals that are sort of grazing those really open, arid, harsh climatic extensive environments. Pursue the target, and we've got 4 key work areas which are really categories for the types of investments that we're making in order to get to, or to enable our industry to achieve a carbon neutral position. So I'll go through these individually shortly, but they are industry leader, heavy focus for us in Australia. Carbon storage and integrated management systems. And since 20 in research and development of technologies that would be for the purpose of pursuing a carbon neutral position. So I'll go through some of those investments individually now. So in the leadership building work area, this work area is all about how we're working with our producers or farmers. They should think about how carbon flows through their production systems, and then what types of data they should try and be collecting that they can then use to demonstrate what their net carbon position is or what their environmental performance is. So we've developed a number of online tools for our farmers to use. We've got some carbon accounting tools and also some Carbon 101 e-learning modules. We're also piloting at the moment a carbon edge program. So we have packages called edge packages that are sort of 1.5 to 2 day workshops that consist of sort of up to 20 participants and a teacher that will deliver material to raise awareness and understanding about carbon, but also what types of activities farmers can implement in their farm to develop some longer term training and extension packages that are more about demonstration. So having producers involved with us to actually be adopting some of the new technologies that we're working on, and then teaching their neighbours and fellow producers about what has worked and what hasn't worked to try and generate that widespread adoption that we'll need to be successful. In the carbon storage work area, the main activities that we're doing in this work area are to develop new technologies for remotely sensing the amount of carbon that's stored in soils, because it can be quite costly to measure soil carbon at the moment. And we're also looking in terms of increasing or decreasing soil carbon is to various grazing management practices. And we're also doing a lot of work with trees on farm, and our focus here, livestock are produced so that they not only can store carbon in the vegetation, but also, so as I said, the emissions avoidance area is the biggest focus for us. That's because we acknowledge that the more we can reduce the amount, the main GHG, of course, from livestock is methane, and the more that we can reduce it, the less we have to rely on storing carbon in the landscape to balance it out. So 3-NOP was mentioned in the previous talk. We're also focusing on another additive called Asparagopsis, which is a seaweed, and we found that with both of these additives in a feedlot environment, we can reduce the amount of methane that's produced by about at least 80%. So we're also very focused on how we can deliver those additives in grazing systems, and we're looking at licks and lick blocks as well as additives through water supply. A lot of farmers in Australia also use genetics in their cattle herds and sheep flocks. And so we're doing some big projects to measure methane from large numbers of animals so that traits related to methane can be used in the current genetic selection indices that are available in Australia. And then we've also got a focus on the use of high quality pastures that include legumes and other best practice management practices to reduce methane as well. The integrated management systems work area is where we're trying to work with the federal government and end users of data, such as the government, banks, retailers and processors, to try and enable producers to better demonstrate their performance to those end users. So I mentioned we've developed an MLA carbon calculator, and we've got some other carbon accounting tools and resources. We also work with our federal government to provide information that will inform methodologies for carbon crediting projects. So we have a pretty mature carbon market in Australia, and under sort of defined methodologies, producers can demonstrate that they're reducing emissions or storing carbon as a secondary source of income. And then another piece of work we're doing is sort of going beyond carbon and looking at some of the other emerging areas of interest for demonstrating environmental sustainability and developing platforms to enable farmers to put data into a platform that they can share with banks or retailers or processors. And with other new additives emerge, and we're wanting to do some research on those, but we're also looking at what sorts of compounds can be the potential for the additive to also have a weight gain benefit, and so a productivity benefit, so that it's not just reducing. Looking at developing partnership investments in methane reduction and measuring devices. And also partnerships it can be tricky to multiple ones of those as they nanoparticle species. So just a very common topic at the moment. I think everybody's intending to coordinate and collaborate better, and I think as individual organisations and countries to assign tasks, and in that way we can possibly prevent sort of duplication of research and be more open with the outcomes of our research and sharing them. And I think that will result in better outcomes for the planet. So in Australia, we're really trying to focus on systems that we have in Australia, and we've got a relatively sophisticated research environment as well. And so we're really keen to keep focusing in on that, and then to share the knowledge that we generate with all the other countries and organisations that might need it. We're really in a phase where we're wanting to collaborate better across the globe. So with Vietnam, I'm very keen to keep talking with people at the conference today. We're talking a lot with organisations in New Zealand and Ireland. We're starting conversations with Uruguay and the USA. Our funding that we've got available for agricultural research in ways that we can have the best outcomes, and happening across the planet in this space. Really just some food for thought at this stage, but keen to talk further. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and it'll be great if you can hang around for the obvious questions that will come later. I think we'll move to the next online presentation now, which is meeting net zero emissions in the beef cattle sector. Professor Ben Hayes from Zero Emissions CRC, Coffee. So come in Brisbane also, I think.
Hi there. Yes, Dominique. Just a quick sound check. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well, and we can see you well as well.
Excellent.
We can't see your presentation yet. I think they're working on that.
I can share my screen if you like, or would you like to?
Perfect. No, you can share your screen. That's great.
Okay, is that sharing well?
Yep, it's great, Ben. So go ahead.
Okay, I'll hook into it. So thank you to our first speaker. It was really interesting to see priorities and really good opportunities, I think, for collaboration with Vietnam. And thanks also to Margaret, because she's really covered the ground here well. And I'm going to expand on some of the opportunities and just maybe flesh a few of them out a little bit in this presentation. So first of all, just to reinforce what Margaret said, in Australia, agriculture is responsible for 16.8% of our emissions. So it's quite an important sector. A majority of that, in fact, about 70% is from grazing livestock, and particularly beef and sheep. And this is the place where it's actually really hard to reduce emissions. So as Margaret said, this is a focus for a lot of us. The other big challenge here is any solution we come up with has to be low cost. Otherwise, it's not going to be profitable or even cost neutral for the farmers that we're asking to adopt these solutions. And one of our big cattle companies, pastoral companies, has given us a target of any solution must cost less than 20 cents per day per animal, because otherwise the reductions in emissions and the carbon credits they can claim for that don't offset the cost of the intervention to lower the emissions. So they've given us this quite a difficult target, but it's good to know where we have to aim of less than 20 cents per day per animal for any intervention. So the interventions or the method for reducing emissions that are closest to market and are in fact being used by some companies now in their feedlots are these feed additives that Margaret talked about, 3-NOP, which is a chemical, and Asparagopsis, which is a seaweed that when fed to animals, to cattle, can reduce methane emissions by 30 to 90%, depending on how much is fed and in what circumstances. So these are real live ways that people can reduce methane. They work particularly well in feedlots because it's easy to deliver. There are still questions about cost effectiveness, and the real question is, as Margaret said, how do you deliver these additives in an extensive environment? The other, I guess, challenge is you have to deliver these to animals every day, all the time, to get these large reductions as well. So very good solutions, but we need other solutions as well. And something else that is emerging is they're perhaps not the silver bullet. In some circumstances, like a feedlot, they might be able to reduce methane emissions by 90%. But when you look at a grazing situation, it might be more like 30 to 40%. So you need something else as well. So genomic selection, genetic and genomic selection is another pathway. You also have them genotyped for DNA markers, and you link up those DNA profiles. The amount from a lot of experiments done by us and around the world, it's about 20% genetic, and that's great. That means we can make it expensive to measure. The cattle the machine measures the amount of methane they're burping off. That's an expensive process to measure cattle with the device. Years to set up the done and the methane measurements made, so we can use DNA markers after that to screen for animals. So this is perhaps a low, and it's worked successfully. It's very likely to work as long as we measure enough animals. It's going to be a perhaps slow process, but cumulative. So after a number of generations of selection, we'll be able to make a real impact on methane emissions. and it's also a low-cost solution because you just have to select out and breed from the animals that have low methane emissions. This is a solution being pursued very actively in Ireland, also in Australia, and also in Europe. And for grazing livestock, it's a good solution. As I said, it does require large reference populations of genotyped and phenotyped animals, so animals measured for methane. And we're setting ourselves up with various projects to do that. I just want to point out as well that selection for other traits can also reduce methane emissions in the system. Feed conversion efficiency, there's quite a good correlation between feed conversion and methane emissions. So the more efficient animals emit less methane. So that's a double win because you can have more beef produced for the same amount of feed and also less methane. Selection for improved fertility can also improve or reduce farm system emissions. If you can improve fertility, you dilute anything you can do to improve efficiency tends to reduce methane emissions. And that can be quite a substantial effect. That if you can alter the rumen of an animal early in life to be a low emitting rumen, that alteration can actually persist for quite a few number of years after you've made that early alteration. So for example, you can feed young animals things like feed additives that reduce methane emissions. That can set the rumen up, if you do it at the right time, to be a low methane emitting rumen for quite a number of years into the future. So that's a very exciting area because it's potentially low cost, but more research in that area is required. There's one really good experiment that shows that's possible, and that result is shown in the graph here, but there's more research to be done there. And then lastly, on the interventions you can make that really do have an impact on emissions, incorporating legumes and pastures that reduce methane can reduce emissions from the system by 10 to 15%. So these by cattle, a legume that can be grazed by cattle, can reduce farm systems emissions quite considerably. Something else, we're looking into emissions. So for example, of the pasture, you might be able to do that by gene editing. You can reduce emissions from the livestock that graze that pasture. And that potentially is quite a low cost way of reducing emissions. So quite exciting. Array of technologies, I guess, some very promising and some that are actually on the market already, technology held up to a farm systems level, and there are others that are more prospective. I think it's really important to think about the cost profile of these technologies. Our pastoral company that we work with gave us this target of less than 20 cents a day, but we really need to think about our farmers adopting this technology for them. Clear that I think we're faced with a future where we have to think about stacking technologies together in a farm system to get to net zero. And that leads me nicely on to the last part of this presentation, put together in Australia, and we're just waiting on the funding announcement for now, where we have the opportunity to do things like stack lots of technologies together or multiple technologies together on demonstration farms to see how far we can push the beef industry towards net zero. So this is our zero net emissions from agriculture cooperative research centre. And a cooperative research centre is an Australian scheme where industry and research gets together and say, we really need a big program of work in a particular area to have a big impact. And that's exactly what happened here. Industry, our agricultural industries, and the researchers got together, worked out and required to get ag industries to adopt these pathways. In Australia, so Australia has different states, different governments. Each of those states has Department of Agriculture, ranging from beef production companies that have lots of farms around the country, right through to supermarkets who are interested in selling net zero beef, for example. There's banks in there, ag tech companies, Indigenous land organisations as well. So Aboriginal enterprises that own pastoral companies and so on. There's about 8 or 9 universities across Australia have come together. And we also have farmer groups and natural resource management groups. So these are, if you can work with these groups, it's a very good way to get adoption because they have large numbers of farmers in those groups. And a really key part in sites around the country, greenhouse gas mitigation, far we can go to net zero. And these MLA is done in this area. MLAs. So just to give you pastures that reduce emissions through gene editing, through breeding, and so on. In the animal space, we need more work on how do we measure individual, build on the work that MLA has done. Also, lifetime. There's another part here as well, which is about looking at native shrubs and grasses. Some of them will have methane mitigating compounds. How can we incorporate them into the farming system? Then program 3 is really about the whole farm enterprise benchmarking and carbon footprinting so that businesses can demonstrate what their footprint is. Again, this work expands on what Margaret was talking about. Also looking at to have this and this in your carbon accounting. How do you incorporate that into the systems we're setting up? And that's really a trade-off with other emerging priorities like biodiversity maintenance. And then just finally, program 4, where are the key points where you can reduce the space? So renewable energy program. So I'll stop there, but
in front of you, I can.
There a clicker? I work for a firm called Pollination.